Our next guest is Melanie Bennett as Executive Director for the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate. Melanie's team has been playing an instrumental role not only to support the advancement of a new First Nation school board, but also while providing stewardship on key issues and priorities in the territory. Under the guidance of the Chiefs Committee on Education, the Yukon First Nation Education Directorate launched in the summer of 2020 in response to a long overdue need for a unified control over First Nations education in the territory. Joining me to talk about the latest developments on the frontiers of an important and exciting educational journey is Executive Director of the Yukon First Nations Education Directorate, Melanie Bennett.
Merci.
Welcome. Welcome, Melanie. For all those people that may not know who you are or the journey that you're on, we just ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself for the viewers today.
Okay. Shojere Melanie Bennett, Chondakachin Diche, Dawson City Diche, Whitehorse Huchin, Jur Diche, Alice Titus, Etcha Alfred Titus Wathu, Nihe Dashe Shotrin Lai. I said, my name's Melanie Bennett. I'm from Dawson. I live in Whitehorse right now. I'm Wolf. I am the granddaughter of Alice and Alfred Titus. And I always try to acknowledge my mom as well. I was really happy to see her little blurb in the newspaper about when she was re-elected as one of our former chiefs for the then Dawson Indian Band, now known as Chondakachin First Nation. And I said, I'm happy to be here today. So
it's a pleasure to have you, Melanie. And one of the biggest directions that we're given out of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow is education. Obviously going through the horrific experiences through the residential school system, let alone the lack of identity, let alone the lack of opportunities. Today, under your leadership, the door is wide open, if you will, when it comes to that. So can you talk a little bit about where we've gone maybe in the last 50 years, if you will, when it comes to education, because you've been intimately involved in many capacities, and talk a little bit about the opportunity that we have today.
Yeah. 50 years. I'll tell you an ironic fact in that it was 50 years ago that I actually started my first entrance into the school system. So I just gave away my age. We didn't start at 5 years old then. And it was into grade 1. We didn't have kindergarten then. And we came in from, my parents owned the Ogilvy River Lodge on the Dempster Highway. And we came in from operating my grandparents' trap line, and we were the last gas stop. So I had grown up out on the land 123 miles up on the Dempster Highway. That was my world that I knew to go to school in Dawson. I'm one of 12, number 10. And I questioned throughout my life, why was I the only one of the 10 or the 12 that had made it through the school system? It was a big question that I always had. But I always had these huge, strong mentors of women in my life. My grandmother, I was happy to see lots of her pictures sitting in the old CYI. She was always at the table. And one of those ladies who was the few, I remember her, some of our elders talking in the community that Alice wore a pantsuit when it wasn't popular for women to wear pantsuits. But she was a very strong woman. And my main mentor in life, she started teaching me when I was young and said that at the age of 4, when I had learned how to read up on the Dempster, that I would be a teacher. Tried to go against that and tried to become a doctor, and finished my first degree and figured out that my grandmother was right, and went into teaching at the ripe age of 23. But I had that question always burning in the back of my head of how come I was the only one who was successful in the system. And I wouldn't really call it success. I always say I timed out. I always crossed my fingers I would never get the student that I was in high school in my class. Yes. But I did. I got lots of them. I had that question all the time because in my growing up, I was with my mom when she was the chief, and I would go to many of those meetings that I'm reading about Yancey, because my mom was one of the people who had to regain her status. And my grandmother on many of those meetings. I can remember my grandmother kissing my grandpa goodbye when he was coming to have a meeting in Whitehorse with the Yukon Native Brotherhood. So there was always that connection in there of how important it was. And my mother always reminded me of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. 2/3 of that document is written on education. And she always felt that it was very important for us, even though we weren't successful in the public education system, we had to go and learn. And I really appreciated what James was just saying before me, my soaking it up, going, it isn't always about that piece of paper that says, you know, I have a degree in this or I have a certificate in this. It's about coming back and benefiting our communities in different ways. And he was just talking about Burwash. I was in Burwash last night, and I was one of the gentlemen in the meeting we were in, talked about how his grandmother protected him and kept him on the land and wouldn't let him go get a degree. And he had more value and more teachings to our people than that person who had that certificate on the wall. And I think that's what my grandmother was trying to teach me, that you're going to go out and you're going to learn all this, but you have to make sure you come back and serve our people and do it in this way so that they can understand the importance of learning. There's a big difference between learning and an education.
I appreciate that. So just in regards to that, you and I have had the pleasure of working together since like 2004, 2005 on the Yukon First Nation, advisory committee. I always appreciated your pushback to the fact that what are we doing here? Why aren't we being used more than what we are? And today, now you have the opportunity to make these pivotal changes, not only for the betterment of our next generation, but you're also challenging the systems that we've been living in, if you will, for a number of years. Can you talk a little bit about why the system is not working for us, and what is some of the key differences that we have to make in order to incorporate not only our traditional ways but also more success for our people today?
Yeah. I think one of the things that really benefited me to learn and understand that was that my first initial introduction into education was in a First Nations education system. It was a First Nations school that was operated by the Chief and Council. And they were who we had to answer back to and make sure we were doing it. There were no other, it was the community that determined what was the needs for those children. And we've had to try and navigate the system of learning our ways, which have a lot of value. I'm an excellent math teacher. And the only reason I was good at math is because my grandmother taught me how to bead. And I had learned very young how to navigate and use those traditional values that my grandmother and my grandfather, my aunties had given me to navigate in a system that it wasn't built upon that. It was built upon a colonial model of let's pump them out so that they have the skills to be in these industrial employment opportunities that we need to have them with. And being able to push that in a different direction by utilizing what I had learned from my grandmother was probably an advantage. We hear sometimes now we learn to walk in two worlds. And I think my grandmother had the wisdom to know that really when I was a little girl and taught us to do that. But then it was my mom who she always said to me, I never lived my life the way according to anyone else's rules. I always did what was right, and I'm good with that. And she always encouraged me, it doesn't matter how difficult it is, speak up. Don't. She said, you can have the courage to speak and defend for yourself, but you better be brave enough to speak up for the person who doesn't have that ability. And she ingrained that in me. And so I actually learned to be a really good principal in the school because I spent a lot of time outside the principal's office. Yeah. Because I was always going, hey, that's not right. Or did you think of it this way? And sometimes you had to push and ask questions that people didn't like. And now in this world, sometimes it's the questions that governments don't like, right? They don't like hearing that. It's hard to say, it's not working for us. We need to change that. But you have to be brave enough to have that conversation and put it out there that it can be done in a different way. And it isn't always about a certificate on the wall. I can say that I have 3 degrees. I never hang them on my wall because the most important thing to me are the things that my grandmothers and my aunties and my mom taught me how to do and how to bring that for anyone to learn from it and then be a good community member.
And over the course of your career, you've been held many capacities, as you mentioned, as a teacher and as a principal, and now you're leading the First Nation Education Directorate. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the challenges our youth still face today? And we need to be honest with a lot of these things because, I mean, this is the reality we're facing, right? So,
you know, back in the day, remember when we were in the Yukon First Nations Education Advisory Committee? And I remember seeing some of the statistics, and there was deputy ministers and ministers that were all sitting there, and they wanted to know about this education reform was coming out. And I just flatly said, that's about the 50th research paper they've done on us. Do we need another one of them? We already know that the system's not working for them. Can we just start doing stuff that will change it? And it was really hard for them to hear those conversations. And that's kind of really the piece that I want to get to, is that I really had to pick apart, and I look at the system now, working in it, from going from a First Nations system to a public education system. And I actually say I started on the land system, being up the Dempster as a child. Transitioning through that really made me key in on some of the things that would, bring success, because lots of times the school system is designed to look at the deficit of a child, the things that they cannot do. But very rarely does it look at what they can do. And for us as First Nations people, that's the first thing we do. What are the things that my kid can do, and how good are they at it? My grandmother had identified in me that I was going to be good at sewing. I sew every day. I still don't consider myself a master yet, but I'm very good at it. And so she focused on that strength and then tied it into others. My mother had identified I was actually a pretty good speaker. So she focused on that and made sure, I was giggling at James before me, he did Toastmasters. My mom made me do Toastmasters. You ever tried doing Toastmasters when you're 15 years old? It's not that easy. But she said, you're a good speaker, you're going to be doing that. And so we focus on that. How do you bring that together in a system called education? And it speaks to that there has to be what James had said there, 1 foot on the land, one hand on the computer, but it's also that you have to be able to navigate both those systems. And that's something that is a challenge for our kids. The moment that they come into school, they're being assessed in a different model. School life is very different than home life. And there is no bridge into that. And we see inklings. I think the work that we're doing at YFNED, back in 2016 when that first started, people say what started there. It actually started in 1973 with Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. It took a repeated amount of attempts of papers being written, many people before me who had talked about, we need to bring that change. But in 2016, when something was not operating with the Joint Education Action Plan, that was when the First Nations said, that's enough. And I was quite honored when I was approached. I was a principal and was asked to bring that visioning session together to talk to the communities, and had to think about how am I going to do this, because I was the principal of an elementary school and I was doing it off the side of the desk. And it was challenging because I had just been reprimanded for delivering to leadership about my master's thesis, which was on building culturally responsive schools. And I just had made the simple statement of, why is it so hard for people to understand that it's okay to have a First Nations school? That's a pretty simple question, right? What is the issue in that? And it was that entrenched colonial model that this is what a school is. But many regions across Canada, the First Nations operate a school, and they do it very well. And we see other models. I had said, look, we have a Catholic model in the Yukon, and we have a French immersion and a French first language model, and nobody questions that. So why would you question the First Nations model? And I think that was really a pivotal moment in that meeting. It was in 2010, I think. With leadership, that we have to just say the blunt facts about it and speak about it and then start moving it forward. So when I was asked to do that work and do the visioning, I again went back to my grandmother. It has to be the community that drives it. So we have to hear from the people what they want. And I did not want to write another report. I actually thought the thing that we moved forward with, that was selected to move forward with, the framework agreement, that two-phase process with negotiating the First Nations School Board agreement first, and then moving in as an interim step, and then First Nations could carry it further. I actually didn't think they were going to pick that one. I was really surprised when they did that. I looked at Darren, and we had a little bit of a Darren Lace, a little bit of a trying to decide on which of the 7 options they were going to pick, and I didn't think it was going to be that one, and I was very surprised and humbled that it was selected because of the collaborative ability to do that, and that they would have to continue to teach our kids that you're going to have to walk in both worlds. It doesn't matter what it is. You're going to have to learn how to do that, and that part I really appreciated.
For sure. And if you're just tuning into Shone FM or Facebook Live, you're listening to the 50th anniversary of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow speaker series. And we have Executive Director of the Yukon First Nation Education Directorate, Melanie Bennett, on the couch today. So just in regards to responsibility, and we talk about the master tuition agreement in the 60s, and you informed me actually there was 2 master tuition agreements. The responsibility for First Nation education became a political football for us. It was between the Yukon government, the federal government, and First Nations caught in the middle, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about whose responsibility is for education? Because we look back to our inherent right to have a good education, let alone the Yukon government gets all the bells and whistles, all the funding, and all the infrastructure to provide that. Yet we're caught in this struggle of who's responsible for us. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that and where that thought will take us?
Yeah. I'm Trondukachin, and as a Trondukachin citizen, my First Nation, we have the inherent right to our children's education, full stop, in the core of my heart. What you speak of with the master tuition agreement, I now know, and this is where you have to be brave, right? When we took on the organization, I said, how am I going to advance this when we're constantly in this loop of do a report, go back to government, a government has responsibility for this, and I didn't know the whole story, so I wanted to know the story. I knew our self-governing agreement. I grew up with my mother as a chief. It's in my family. I have family members. We've known it. You have to be brave enough to do stuff like you have to ATIP the Privy Council of the federal government. And we did that. It took us 2 years to get the information, but I was patient. And I actually did find out, because we did have the 1964 version of the Master Tuition Agreement, where the federal government had handed jurisdiction of Indian education at the time to the territorial government. My question was, did they talk to the First Nations about that? And so I was, okay, I want to find that out. But it meant I had to ATIP the Privy Council. And by the way, it cost $5 to do that. So I think they owe us $5 back. Anyways, we wind up getting all of it. And I learned that the Master Tuition Agreement actually extended from 1958 to 1968. And they actually had 4 versions of it, of where it had gone back and forth. So, okay. What I was looking for was, when did they talk to the First Nations to say this was okay? So he asked that question of why. Back in the day, that was when residential schools were being categorized as being defunct. They had to close them all down. The federal government was giving jurisdiction of First Nations education back to the First Nations. So all of those regions across Canada where you see that they have their own First Nation schools, Senpak Chin, Mi'kmaq, Kinamataway, they all have their own schools and school systems. That jurisdiction transferred back to them it all started in around the early 50s, it was 52. And they handed jurisdiction back to them, having agreements with the multitude. We see education agreements with those First Nations across Canada. But in the territories, the federal government made the decision to give jurisdiction of First Nations education to the territorial government. And they did not talk to the First Nations. That, to me, was a fatal error. I actually did find out in the ATIP that they talked to 12 First Nation people that all worked for the territorial government. It was, so, okay, my mother taught me, you have to say it. Those are the facts. And it was an error that was made. So we're holding that to account. We have to say that, okay, that was an error. Go to 1973, when that document was passed, they were fully aware, Pierre, Elliott, Trudeau was fully aware that they had already given jurisdiction to the territorial government. And we delivered that document saying 2/3 of education we're not satisfied with them. That would be a question right there, and they didn't address it, did they? So it was always intriguing to me that that document led to such a force to be reckoned with us in regards to our land claim settlement and where we are in regards to that. But education just seemed to be pushed off on the table because it was a political football that they didn't want to take on. And their plan was, okay, let's just try and split it up to the pot so small that they won't go after it then. And they succeeded in it. In 2016, when we advanced on and said, okay, let's start asking these questions, we had the visioning sessions on what would it be if it was our own system. And it was just the First Nations at the table. There was nobody else. And that was one of the things that when I talked with the chiefs, I said, look, we've all been trying to do this collaboratively. How about we just sit down with the First Nations like they did in the beginning and talk about it and see what it is that we truly want. And that's where those 7 options came out. And then they had decided upon the 7th one, which was to negotiate the framework agreement process. And I appreciated in that last meeting, it was February of 2018, that one of the First Nations stood up and said, great, if you're going to do that, you go back and you get chief and council resolutions from each of the chief and councils. And I was like, oh. I looked at Darren and I was like, oh, I just finished doing a 2-year community consultation process off the side of my desk. So it's a little dismal. And I remember Darren Lee's patting me on the back and saying, it's okay, Bennett, it's going to be okay, right? He was encouraging me. But I was so thankful for that, because it gave us an opportunity to even go and have a deeper conversation with the First Nations. And 4 of them said, you know what, we're going to hold and we're going to watch what you do. And that's totally within their power. And I thought, that is so perfect. When you're making big moves like that, it's so good that you just don't jump right in, right? And you figure it out. And we started to advance forward with 10. So, and now we're in that work, and the first part of it, I know sometimes it makes me unpopular with government because I still have to ask the hard questions and push, is it was 2019, actually, December of 2019 when YFNED was formed. And then it was January of 2022, so in 2 short years. And I thank the chiefs for their wisdom on that. They had put in those discussions, they said, you know, we've been trying to do this. We have all these reports. We've been sitting at the negotiation table. It's always been done off the side of their desk, someone else's desk. We need an organization. They had identified that in the people who had presented to us about their own systems. They had an organization to advance that forward. We need to start our own.
And now we fast forward to 2023, if you will, and now we're canvassing more schools to join on to the First Nation Education Board model. And the fact that now you've created an organization that is now reaching out, and one of my favorite parts of it is the First Nation advocates, because we have a lot of our own people now that have not necessarily had found success in the school system as well, now supporting kids through the system that once failed them. So it's an ironic, if you will, situation to be in, but I see the beauty in that. Can you talk a little bit about your team and some of the not only the motivation that you provide to them, but what motivates them, if you will?
On a daily basis, I tell my staff, we are here to serve the Indigenous students in the territory. I make sure that that's their elevator pitch. If someone asks them in the elevator, what do you do? And I don't need them to explain out the role of an education advocate. I need them to say, we're here to support Indigenous students in the territory. And the chiefs gave me that mandate. Our ed advocates, our wraparound service model that we provide is really there to ensure that our students are being successful in a system that doesn't really flex and move to their needs as Indigenous children. and also to provide the roadmap for some educators. I'm an educator at heart, a primary educator, by the way. I really like teaching grade 2. It was my favorite. But being in that system and working in a First Nation system and seeing where it came from a strength-based model to working in the public education system where it's a deficit-based model. And it's the educators that need a lot of help in understanding how to support our students. And it's just not developed, and it needs to be developed. So the wraparound model was really to have the right supports in place for our students, but also to help the educators as well, and the people who are working in the system, if they're willing, because they have to be willing to do that as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can remember starting them off, I was told by some government officials that the ed advocates were not allowed in the schools. And I had to say, hold on a second. I still have those emails just to remind me. I went, hold on a second here. You have an Indigenous organization that's been set in play by the chiefs that's saying this is what we need for our students, and you're going to tell me that you're not going to let them in the door? So you have to be brave enough to have those conversations and just push it out there. And now I can say we are successfully moving the goalposts for our First Nation students. I look at it's not just the culture camps, it's the one that I just recently looked at through our math advocates, is that we have a jump in our math results this year. We implemented them last year, and it was really, we targeted those students from COVID that have a gap in their learning, and we said, okay, let's hit them so that they're going to get some math camps and some different things done in our way. And then we put them towards the proficiency index for math, and we just checked it, and they've all improved. Because we know if we try and do that and focus on their strengths, and their strengths are when they're learning math, they do it on the land, and they learn it through different activities, not necessarily from the books, because the guys that have to put that together have got to figure out those activities and how they're going to deliver. And it's not that easy to deliver trigonometry when you're out making pitch salve.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Yep. They have to figure out how to do that. And then the organization is the backbone behind that helps them to get the resources and the pieces so that they can do that.
For sure. And you talked about statistics and indicators. How is Yukon First Nation Education Directorate, looking at our students in a different light versus, pass or fail, or, A student, B student? Is there a way that you're looking at them in the holistic approach as a full person?
Yeah. It's a very simple model. We want them to be successful community members. Mm-hmm. We have one of this fall-offs from COVID that was a beauty, and you have to pay attention to these things by paying attention and keeping the pulse of the community and having that connection to our communities. During COVID, our youth were in halftime learning, so it was halftime in class, and it's not the government's fault. I'm not saying that from a blame. That's what they had to deal with what we had in that pandemic. Half of them would be in class in part of the day, and then the other half of the day they were supposed to be doing on learning. It put First Nations at a huge disadvantage because the majority of us don't even have internet. Believe it or not, I didn't have internet at home. Just got it 2 months ago. One of our advocates was down on Main Street, and he said the kids they're not doing online learning. And so I deployed the advocates down there to recruit them. And we brought them in and said, look, we'll help you here to do your schoolwork. And we really listened to the youth. Something that as an educator I've always advocated for is that I've been on curriculum design committees. I've been on so many different committees in education. And it's all these adults sitting around talking about how they're going to design this for our students, and then nobody talked to the students. Mm-hmm. And I had this one young man from Ross River who said, I don't want to learn that. I don't want to do that. He said, I actually want to know how to balance my bank book, and I want to know how to apply a credit card for a credit card, and I want to know how to do my taxes. My focus is not to get him a grade 12. My focus is to figure out just what James said here, is that there's going to be a bunch of skills that kid's going to develop that's going to help him to become a community member. it isn't always about going to university. It isn't always about going to post-secondary. It's about building the self-esteem and confidence in each of the children so that they can become effective, confident community members in a different way. Mm-hmm. The smartest person I know, I've got multiple degrees, the smartest person I know is my brother. And my brother has a grade 6 education and has built multiple buildings in the Yukon and award-winning buildings in my hometown of Dawson. Our cultural center was his work. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about going and getting a degree. He's far better at math than I am. But we don't focus on that. We focus on, you got to get through this industrial model of K to 12. So my hope down the road with the First Nations School Board Agreement as an interim step, and the reason I now know that was selected was because the elders in the room turned and said, we don't know what our way is anymore. It was taken from us from residential school, and we have to learn that. Mm-hmm. So we pitched that idea as it was an interim step that they could learn that. And some of our First Nations are moving towards that. Some are already ahead of it, and they're doing other things. We see it in immersion programs. We see it in other aspects of what they're doing in their community. But ultimately, it's to get to the point that we define the education piece for us. Mm-hmm. And then we build the community members that would come back to our communities and serve us.
Awesome stuff. And just to wrap things up, Melanie, I'll give you 2 minutes to give us the elevator pitch for those nations and school bodies that haven't not signed on to the board. What is the benefit?
No,
the Bennett benefit.
The benefits. For the very first time, I am actually seeing, and this is someone who spent 15 years working in the Yukon public education system and 13 years working in the BC public education system, that this is the first time I'm seeing where it's being led by First Nations. And things that we have been asking, things that are in that document of saying we need our children learning this, we need our children doing this, are now happening. Mm. Benefit of that, the sense of joy and pride our children will have in themselves. We have 7 generations to change the trauma of residential school. And we are only into the 2nd generation right now. Yeah. So to have that light in my eyes that we are on the right path of it and it's happening, because the board is 7 months old. Mm-hmm. I think, it was February 14th, 2023. The Chiefs, in 2022, the Chiefs had signed the agreement. And they agreed with the minister. I think she's in the, yep, she's right there. Yeah. They when they were discussing when are we going to sign and propose this agreement, both of them were like, February 14th is the perfect day. It's together today for our children tomorrow. This year, it's 1 year for the board that they've been in existence. And I just look forward to the fact that, when the ground and in the gains that we've made in this 1 year, and it hasn't been easy, the gains that we've made in 1 year, think of that in 10 years, mm-hmm. and how significant that will be for our children. I look at it as simple as this. Up to here, First Nations have had to go to government who are driving the bus and say, we need this for our kids. And constantly ask the bus driver, can you turn it this way? Right? Because we need this for our kids. Where we're at right now with the school board agreement, the First Nations are going to an Indigenous organization who is driving the bus and has a better understanding of what direction to go when they're driving that bus.
Sheesh. And with that, Melanie, just want to thank you very much for your time today, but also your dedication and commitment to the process, and great job. And it does take leaders such as yourself to move and advance not only our positions, but also the opportunity.